So I came to Colorado State from Wisconsin, and I was excited about the fact that this is the first state that I'm going to be able to do some research that had an in-state tuition policy. So I thought, wow, what a great way to understand what institutions and what are they doing to sort of support undocumented students in the state of Colorado. So this is what this research is about. I'm actually going to start with just sort of like giving you the landscape of how this issue is, and then focus down on my research. So who are undocumented students? For the most part, 2/3 are from the Latinx background. Not all documented students are from Latinx. There's an increasing number of Asian undocumented students and Black undocumented students. They are brought to the United States involuntarily. They grew up here for the most of their in the United States and received the majority of their education in the U.S. Many of them are first-generation low-income students. The way I got introduced to this topic was when I was working on my doctorate. I was part-time working with a TRIO program, and a student tried to access our service and qualified because they're first-generation low-income, but weren't able to utilize our services because they were not Pell eligible. Undocumented students don't qualify for federal financial aid. Many of them are unaware of their status, so it's until they apply for a driver's license, depending on your context, right? Or they try to apply for college, is when they start to understand their status. And many of them typically attend community colleges, and you'll kind of see in a minute why. So, approximately 4 million immigrants are living in the U.S., 11.7 of them are undocumented. 56% of those are from Mexico. And children account for about 1.8 million. Every year we have 65,000 students graduating from high school that are undocumented. And deportation enforcement under President Obama was at a record 2 million people. So I say that because undocumented communities have always lived in the cloud of deportation. The difference that I see now is that there's not any discretion about who is deported and who is not, whereas I saw that a little bit in the past. So how this topic has been litigated in education. So in Texas, the Flyer versus Doe case was litigated at the K through 12 level. This was children trying to access public elementary school or secondary school education. And so the courts have decided that folks don't need legal status to obtain a high school diploma or participate in any of the public education at the K through 12 level. The first time it was litigated at the higher education level was the Leticia A case. And that was at a time where they were able to give in-state tuition to undocumented students, and they had later rescinded that ruling in the early 1990s. So the DREAM Act was very promising at the time, and it was really disappointing that, 2010, after a decade of working on it and trying to pass it, that it was filibustered on the Senate floor. It's also important to note that it was bipartisan support, but 5 Democratic senators did not vote for this bill. We then had the executive order, or the executive action by President Obama called the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA. So this was recently rescinded, and this allowed those that are eligible to receive a work permit for 2 years. So they have to reapply, they're vetted, they have to submit a lot of information, including their address, fingerprints. So these individuals were vetted, very much so. And I think what's giving pause for all of us is that the government holds this information. And while students in good faith gave this information up for this particular benefit, a lot of us hope that it's not going to be used to pursue these students. So what we have right now is different legislation in the docket. The Bridge Act is essentially a federal level of DACA. So DACA was an executive order, and it could be taken away. The Bridge Act is sort of a federal DACA. The DREAM Act is right now we're trying to call for a clean DREAM Act. Because what's happening with the DREAM Act right now is that there's a lot of border enforcement, the border wall, and militarization of the border that they want to put in the DREAM Act. So a clean DREAM Act would be just a standalone bill that would address the educational pathways and the citizenship pathways for those that are eligible for the DREAM Act. And the RISE Act is something that is also under the docket, which is sort of a merit points of which immigrants are allowed in the country and which ones are not. So this is the largest survey that was done on undocumented students at a UCLA. And the findings that I took out that were really stood out to me is that out of 900 respondents, the majority of them spoke of isolation on campus, that they were treated unfairly negatively on their campus due to their legal status, and that they reported significant elevated levels of anxiety. Anxiety scores were above the clinical cutoff level. So this is becoming a public health issue as it is a college access and college persistence issue. So we talked about the different in-state tuition policies. So across the board, all states are different. So as I told you, Colorado has an in-state tuition policy, so do other states. Some states don't have any policy whatsoever. Some states have in-state tuition policy, but is tied to also in-state or state federal financial or federal state aid is attached to their policy. So we look at states like Georgia and Montana. They have a policy that bans undocumented students from being admitted to their colleges. The same with Alabama, South Carolina. It is within their community college system that they've banned undocumented students from enrolling. So again, across the board, there's different ways in which in-state tuition policies are passed. In Michigan, for instance, the University of Michigan system has a policy, but the Michigan state system doesn't. So it gives you a different variability about how these in-state tuitions are not only introduced, but how they're enacted. So the Colorado context, we've seen a lot of immigration growth in the past years, 34%. There was at one point, we did pass legislation that undocumented students to show their proof of their lawful presence. And in 2008, the state passed an in-state tuition or state resident tuition ban. So we haven't been perfect here. We've actually gone through a ban, and we've gone through an in-state tuition. So a lot of how this is all passed is through the ideology of our legislators. And so, so this was a long fight to get this in-state tuition passed here. So I mentioned that the majority of the students start at community college. So what in-state tuition policies mean is that they just they're able to pay the in-state tuition price tag. Well, in-state tuition price tag is very costly, especially if you do not qualify for loans or any financial aid at the federal level. So you see the Colorado Community College system is much more affordable than Colorado State or Boulder or Denver. And if we didn't have this in-state tuition policy, like many states don't, they pay the out-of-state tuition. So that means 3 times as much of tuition that they would have to pay if our state didn't have in-state tuition policy. So in Colorado, there are an estimate about 180,000 undocumented immigrants. About 20,000 of those are between 5 and 18-year-olds. And then we have about 1,600 high school students each year. So that gives you sort of what the Colorado context is about. Okay, so getting into our study, one of the things that we wanted to look at in terms of our study was the racial microaggressions, so campus climate and racial microaggressions. So I used a lot of the literature from Loresano and Yoso about a racial microaggression is sort of a form of overt racism, subtle insults or invalidations of racial ideologies. Collectively, they are racially prejudiced actions, words, symbols, behaviors that work to normalize the everyday ordinariness of racism. So racist nativism by Lindsay Bettis Huber situates the social, political, historical context that's in the U.S. that infiltrates different communities of color. So folks who are perceived as foreign by the national public discourse are treated as such. So the racist nativism connects to both race and immigration. We also draw on some of the campus climate studies here. I am not doing this right. There we go. Specifically, saying that students of color of all races discuss how there is institutional negligence regarding having the tools and opportunities to engage in diverse experience from students from different backgrounds. A lot of these campus climates do not necessarily disaggregate by ethnicity and don't necessarily look at legal status. And so this is sort of the contribution that we wanted to make in the literature, is that our study really looks at legality and how that intersects with race. So these are our research questions. In what ways do self-identified and documented students describe their campus climate? In what ways do faculty and staff describe their campus culture and climate regarding undocumented and documented students? Our conceptual framework that we use is this notion of legal violence, which is essentially drawing from some of the sociology we work on symbolic violence. But legal violence is really how these occurrences that are systematic oppression against immigrants, how they have a negative effect on the livelihoods of immigrants, and how the cumulative effects of these negative effects, of these negativity, in fact derails immigrants from being incorporated into the larger society. So this was a qualitative case study. We examined 2 institutions, one public, one private. As a caveat, all this data was collected before the elections. And so right now we are conducting focus groups on focusing on the political climate, but it's been interesting to just see the difference. And I could talk a little bit about what we've been finding in the focus groups. But yeah, this was all before the elections, so it would be interesting. This is sort of the data analysis that we used to code our data and how we develop themes through memoing. So this is what we found. One is institutional ignorance. One student thought was getting most of the information from international students and scholars, and felt like that's not who I am. And so Sylvia talks about, I called and I was like, I'm not an international student. I graduated from the name of the private school in 2014. I live in Colorado. I'm a Colorado resident, and I am not an international student. And they asked her, do you have a student visa? No. Do you have a social security number? No. Then you are an international student. And so it's students constantly trying to defend their presence. And in fact, it's the constant reminding to our offices about how, because I don't identify in this box, you're just gonna put me in one or another based on your own perceptions of what you think I need. Another instance was that having to not having a way to find information about themselves. And so Patricia talks about Yeah, I think having more, I don't know if it's events or emails or just putting something in place that educates the bigger campus that has, or having those conversations, the bigger campus, because you expect students of color or undocumented students to come and educate everybody who doesn't know, who doesn't understand, and expect us to have those conversations because like I said before, it's an emotional thing. So, and this came up in our focus groups with the political climate stuff, is that students are laboring the majority of the work. They're the ones that have to labor through some of these issues, educate their faculty, educate staff members, use their stories and narratives as ways to educate those around them, and it's an emotional process for them. And I think students are like, we just want to be regular students. You know, we don't always have to want to like share our stories because it gets very exhausting having to labor all of that. The reproduction of pervasive invisibility is a big one. I don't necessarily feel like what we've been collecting in our focus groups, I think that has gotten better. But Ricardo talks about, you know, I feel like that's the problem, is that they don't have an attitude towards us. If I saw blatant hate for us, that's one thing. If I saw blatant acceptance from us, that's another thing. But not saying anything, that's a whole different story. I think it's almost worse than blatant hate for us. People fight hate every day, invisibility is worse. And so it's this notion that because they're invisible, they're dehumanized. They're not seen as person. We're robbing them of their personhood when we don't have anything on our campus that says this is where you belong, or this we accept undocumented students in this way. That has shifted in many ways on certain campuses that we've been talking to. We also noticed the intersection of race and legal status, and so it's not that the campus environment is chilly because they're undocumented students, it's that the majority of these students are Latinx students, you know. And so, like Jaime was saying, you know, he walked up to a group of students that were sitting down, and he just wanted to make friends. And so he's like, I'm gonna try to make friends, introduce myself, and I was talking to them, but they were really having a stupid conversation, so I decided to leave. As I was walking away, I heard the girl say, I don't like these Mexicans coming to my school. Whatever, I don't care. So it's not only that they have to also combat issues, and we have to think about this issue as very intersectional. So it's not that it's only that they are undocumented students, but they're undocumented students and their bodies are racialized on their campuses. Or they're undocumented students and they're also queer. And so a lot of the intersectionalities that they have to navigate not only deal with their legal status, but their other salient identities that they have to also fight for on their campus, in their campuses. The other thing that we found too was this hidden mechanism of support. So nobody was very outright blatant about the support. Nobody was waving a flag, hey, we support undocumented students. And so Selena talks about, you know, I think there's people who are trying to make it something that's more voice throughout campus. I don't think it's something that you can go ask somebody and they will know exactly what you're talking about. I feel like it's very supportive. It's not very supportive or doing anything, at least from at a higher level. I partly feel it's like because there's not a lot of us on campus to do that. But I feel there's not a lot of us because there's nobody that knows that whether the institution thing supports it or not, or what it does with people like me. So because there's no visible support, then students don't want to disclose. Students don't want to come out about their legal status. And so they also feel like, and this is the attitude that many institutions take, is that we don't have a lot of them. Like and nobody's counting, right? But it's just this assumption that they're not here. They're not on our campus. Without understanding that they're not visible on campus because you're not making it a priority on your campus. So I wanted to talk about the faculty voices real quick. And so this is from the faculty and staff that we interviewed. And they talked about sort of the resistance by the Colorado constituents, sort of what do they do with this resistance that they face in supporting undocumented students. One administrator talked about, first off, it's state law. It's the state of Colorado that has set this law, because you should just leave it at that and shut people down. If it goes further, then it's, these students have been paying taxes in Colorado for most of their lives, just like any Colorado resident. So it's almost like we have to defend that their presence at this institution. We give this sort of fiscal imperative, and that's also problematic, to be honest with you, is that let's not just focus on the fact that they're just human beings. Let's not just focus on the fact that it's a moral act to provide education. It's our land grant mission, right? But they have to have contributed something for us to give them something. I think one administrator said that, they were worried about the donation, right? How are donors gonna feel? And one of them said, I believe the president and the board would say, we don't want your money. We wanna do what's morally right. And that was really good to hear too. So we have to ask a lot about, what is it gonna take for staff and faculty to act? And what it took is that they need to make undocumented students a priority, but they need to hear it from the very top. So they thought, I feel like these great things are happening, but I still don't feel like, I guess until I hear from the president say, or if I read it from the president in the newspaper that we fully support undocumented students, that's when I would feel really comfortable with where we're at. Another administrator said, I think it's important enough for us to say that this is a priority. Then I don't think it's hard at all. We create positions all the time. It's just that something has to come from the administrators, people above me, to say it's a priority. So how do we create a position that works specifically with undocumented students? It has to come from the top. And so these are pretty senior administrators in the colleges that we've interviewed, and still feeling like they have limitations. The title of the paper that we're writing for the voices of faculty and staff is called My Hands Are Tied. Because that was the majority of what the staff and faculty talked about, is that, we can't do anything unless it comes from the top and comes from specifically the president, to be honest. So this was really interesting how undocumented students, the notion of harboring and serving were synonymous. So, for instance, at one point, how true this is, but it reflects on the sentiment across the campus shared with our leaders. If a lawsuit came up against one of us as an individual for harboring immigrants or something absurd, that the university would not back us. So we're already criminalizing our students in many ways by using this language. And it's synonymous with, it's not that the students that we serve, it's the students that we're harboring, which was very problematic for me. One faculty talked about, the institution doesn't want to get in a case, involved in a case that's going to make it to the Supreme Court. We don't want to be University of Michigan or Texas. They don't want to be seen at the university that harbors the I word. And it could easily spin into that kind of rhetoric, particularly right now. Again, this is sort of before the election. And so if we think about the conversations that are happening around sanctuary campuses, sanctuary communities, I think what was happening before the election is definitely coming into light and fortitude much more now than then. The last thing I'll talk about is this culture of protection, which talks about, how do we protect the institution? It's a hot potato duty in the public discourse. I think the administrators are doing some work quietly, but no public stances, because it will turn into lightning rods, so they don't want that kind of publicity. So this underground notion really ties back to the hidden support of undocumented students that the students were talking about, is that they don't want to make any noise, they don't want to be public, they want to keep doing this because they don't want that kind of publicity. And then one administrator talked about our approach is really sink or swim. It's really left up to the student to navigate on their own. Because of that, there's a culture to be careful what you put in writing. We have to do backdoor channels, underground approaches to reach students. These are students that we've admitted. These are students that are paying tuition dollars. And yet we are treating them as though, that not only that we're essentially criminalizing them, but it's the culture of the institution that really facilitates this, this risk aversive ideology, this, we're not going to stand up for the students that we have admitted. This is a culture. This is the culture that we see and how faculty are feeling and staff are feeling like they can't really be public allies. Sometimes I'm like, in what world do we not support students at our university? Okay, so the conclusions that I've made is there is a disconnect between climate studies for students of color and their intersection of legality and immigration. We think that legal violence should be added as a construct in the campus studies, surveys. Institutional ignorance on the topic of immigration creates sort of a hostile, unwelcoming climate for undocumented students. And these findings really demonstrate sort of under the auspice of in-state tuition policies, undocumented students are negatively impacted by the invisibility and the ambivalence harbored by faculty and staff, which inflicts legal violence. Some of the recommendations that we make is that colleges and universities mandate statewide trainings for college administrators on how to support undocumented students. We also acknowledge that undocumented students experience legal violence in the classroom, and so specific trainings offered to faculty members. Particularly, we suggest that institutional funds be allocated to hire at least one full-time employee to coordinate the academic and social efforts of undocumented students. We also urge faculty to think about the inclusion policies that have been vetted from by their institutions, like for us would be the principles of community, and place them on their syllabus, but also have conversations on how to dialogue with civility in the classroom around what that means. Placing information about undocumented students on university websites that individuals are able to access and assist students. So this is me. I am an unafraid educator for and with undocumented students. And my previous research focused on social activism. So I have the privilege of working with activists that shut down streets and infiltrated detention centers and stopped deportations. And these were all students that were undocumented. So I always think about if they're able to risk so much and put their bodies on the line like that, as educators, I think we can risk. We are the ones who need to be risking as well. So thank you so much. Any questions?
Stefan, I wanted to make sure that there was plenty of time for dialogue and engagement. So I know you presented a lot of important information, but I really want to open it up.
Yeah. Oh, wait, right here in the back.
Yeah, so I was just wondering if CSU is a sanctuary campus.
No.
Okay, you know why not?
Yeah. So the climate has been on the federal level is that, and California is a really good example, like San Francisco. There's been some heat that they have taken, sort of taking away their federal dollars from that city to sort of punish them for being sanctuary states or a sanctuary city. So that hasn't been acted on, but that's certainly the threat that is out there. And I think universities are really cautious about whether they want to play that game of designating themselves as a sanctuary campus. But I will also say that I don't think we're ready to designate ourselves as a sanctuary campus because that means that we also need to center and prioritize undocumented students on a very systemic level, including curriculum, including the conversations around faculty. I do a lot of work with another entity called Freedom University, which is in Georgia. And that was a counter act of resistance from the ban that Georgia had for undocumented students. And so the research research that I've done with them is that they centralize their curriculum based on the experiences of undocumented students. They allow undocumented students to really dictate sort of what that college experience should look like for them. It's not an unaccredited, institution, but having stepped foot on in this space, I kind of feel like that's what sanctuary means for me, is making sure you're centralizing these voices in meaningful ways. So when I say we're not there yet, I'm talking about for students to holistically feel like this is a safe space, there needs to be way more work. So I'm afraid that that's a badge of honor to me, that we're not ready to listen.
Yeah, you had mentioned that you had conducted this survey prior to the elections, but that you had conducted some focus groups since then. I was wondering if you could share what some of those differences, or if there were any, since with the focus groups compared to the survey.
Right.
Both with the students and then with the faculty and staff.
We haven't done faculty and staff, so we've done
Just students.
students, and not with faculty and staff. So we focus just on students, and for the most part, what we're finding is students are very privy to sort of, okay, one, they're emotionally exhausted, and so we kind of coined this term called citizen fragility, kind of like white fragility, where you feel a lot of guilt around that particular identity. So after elections, and even after DACA was rescinded, they noticed that a lot of their peers were like, how are you? How are you? How are you? And that was exhausting for them. They're just like, I don't need your words. I don't need your tears. I need you to act. I need you to do whatever you need to do. Like, we are the ones that should be getting arrested. We are the ones, like, I think as folks that have citizenship privilege, we need to act in more vigilant ways to be what I call accomplices for and with undocumented students. So that was one thing. They were just like, there's my white girl peer crying for me and saying, I'm not going to class, I feel so bad, I don't know what to do. And here I am, I'm still getting up in the morning and working, I'm still going to class. And so that was something that they talked about. They also talked about that there's still this, I don't know, what we called it sort of like folks that continue to carry this ideology of make America great again in the classrooms, in their safe spaces. So for the most part, they're like, how do I concentrate in class when there's folks wearing these hats or paraphernalia? So we're also trying to see, like, okay, at what point is this free speech? And at what point is this hate speech? In many cases. And so, and there, I live here in Fort Collins, but even going down into Denver, I was sort of like, what? Like, some of their campuses, they were meeting, and some folks called the police on them, or ICE. So they've had their classmates call ICE on them. We had a fraternity down in Denver that was celebrating, had a party when this DACA was rescinded. They called it the DACA celebration, the end of DACA celebration. So it's this notion of hate. I think we need to be a lot more bold, as administrators to shut some of these things down. But then how do we? I'm always like coming from a student affairs background too. Like, how do we make this a learning opportunity for our campus? Or how do we really address the white supremacy that is very much a legacy on some campuses? And what we're also learning is that these meetings and the support, the community, is what is keeping them going, right? So the fact that they have groups that they can meet with, but it goes time and time again in my research for the last 10 years and why these students fight. It is not for them. They don't fight for themselves. They fight for their families. They fight, that is the main reason why they fight. And they know that they have siblings that are coming behind them, and they want to be role models for those individuals. And so, this is what I've heard for the last 10 years. It's like, this is not about me. This is about my community, my family, my parents, but also the graduating seniors that are looking at me as the example. So those are the kind of things that we are getting, is that, and my favorite quote is that, we know that folks, there have been emboldened racists, but we've also been emboldened ourselves. Yeah.
I want to, first of all, thank you. And thanks to your research team for the work that you're doing, and by extension, gratitude to your participants, particularly the students who shared their stories with you. I want to go back to the charge that students, and it seems like faculty and staff also were putting on university presidents to take more clear, tangible action statements of, beyond statements of support, but even statements of support that are much more direct and whatnot. And as sort of from an organizational structure standpoint, we know presidents are not the end all be all. The buck doesn't stop at the
Nope.
president's office, right? And it actually starts with the board of trustees. And I'm wondering what sense you make of the absence of boards of trustees as targets for, y'all need to do something and do something more,
Yeah.
versus the fixating it almost on the president.
Yeah, that didn't necessarily come up as much as the president, but I understand that, yes, our presidents are really an extension or appendage of a larger body that I don't know whether, organizationally administrators understand, like, the influence of that, especially maybe perhaps, cause there was a variety of administrators to like senior to those that are on the ground.
Yeah.
But, I mean, that's a great point, that we haven't really looked at, and, I almost think that, I'm thinking about the institution that is not acting, right, is really rooted in their own, institution ideology. So if they've been risk adverse to other equity issues, they're gonna be risk adverse to this, right? Whereas if there's been leadership on other equity issues, there's gonna be leadership on this. But it's in different ways, it shows up in different ways. And so, I think a lot of it has to do with the ideology
Right.
that is really embedded, entrenched in institutions.
Sure.
And so that's really what's driving,
Yeah.
is that, cause the administrator is saying, yeah, we're kind of race neutral up in here, I'm like, oh, okay. But that's the culture that they're operating under. But I agree that I think maybe teasing out and going back to the focus groups with individuals a little bit more about the border regions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not that the presidents don't have a role
No,
to play. They got a role to play.
Yeah.
Right, but it may be sort of dual, right? So how are they managing up to educate boards, governing
Right.
boards, as well as how are they educating out,
Right.
and leaving out on the campus,
Right.
as well, so. Yeah.
Do
But
you
they're the
have-
most visible actor, I mean,
Right.
students don't see the board, the
No,
governing board,
no.
they see the president.
But yeah, and the other thing that, came up for me at the conference that I just attended was the Association for the Study of Higher Education, and having a dialogue with some folks that are doing similar stuff. Is our legal team, like, privy to some of these issues in a way that they can fight, right? Especially around the free speech stuff. Like, I feel that's gonna be something, we're just gonna have to get better at trying to navigate that. Rather than distance ourselves from those conversations, how do we be more intentional about having them? But that made me think about, I think, from a legal individual team efforts, I think that needs to be more clear.
Given the fact that the majority of the students are attending community colleges, was any of the research, I realize, I assume that those were both universities,
Mhm.
that those studies were done at?
Yes.
Okay. So in terms of how are you generalizing to the attitudes of the students within the community college population?
We're actually going to conduct sort of an appendage of this study to just focus on community colleges. So that's what we're planning to do in the spring, because we're finding that, one, there's not a lot of literature that really focuses on community colleges, but two, there is a sort of assumption that community colleges are sort of leaders and doing more. But what we're also finding is that the students continue to also struggle with, this notion that my hands are tied. Like, yes, we have supportive administrators, but they're not willing to push for us. They're not willing to. So I think from an organizational level, looking at like, okay, what are some of the agency that staff and faculty have within the organizational structures of those community colleges? And given that Colorado is an interesting context, we've been finding some resistance, to be quite honest, with our community colleges about going in. And so we've had to take it to the community and find individuals that are attending community colleges, but through community organizations. Yeah, so that was a little surprising. Yeah. I'm gonna get lots of phone calls saying that I'm on TV.
Well, that raises a question. As a researcher in scholar, who's a very public scholar on these issues, what has been the repercussions of your involvement in this movement? As we look at around the country mounting attacks on particularly pre-tenure faculty.
Right.
Who speak out against injustice and inequity and are targeted.
Yeah, so I think it was contextual. My experience in Wisconsin was a bit different than it has been in Colorado institution-wide. And I call fan mail. I got quite a bit of fan mail in Wisconsin than I have here. But it's been different after the election, to be quite honest with you. I do a lot of keynotes and I speak across the country. And last year was the first time that I had to have police presence in my talk because there was a threat that was inflicted on me for speaking on what I'm speaking on today. And in other cases, there's been a lot more disruption, a lot more disgruntled students wanting to interrupt, wanting to dialogue, but not with being just disruptive and disrespectful in the talks. So where they've had to be asked to move. That didn't start happening until after the election. And so, for me, this is about that these individuals have gifted me these stories, and I feel a lot of responsibility to make sure they are in spaces where they're not only heard, but action happens. And so I write a lot of blogs on a national level. Somebody called out Jeff Sessions for how he described the individuals in when he made his announcement of the rescinding of DACA. I felt like it tore me to my core to hear individuals talk about the community that I work with and for. So I use my words a lot to fight back in many cases, and I'll continue to do so. But these things don't really matter during the tenure process as much. But for me, as a public, scholar, that's where I see the most impact is through my public scholarship. Is that getting emails from a 13-year-old in high school saying that I read your blog and, you know, I now want to think about going to college and I'm undocumented. And this is the first time that I feel really proud of that identity. And that to me is like, okay, I can make it another year, you know, to get that. But essentially, you know, I wish more individuals were like this and not let the confines of the academy really protect the work that they're doing or just confine the work that they're doing within academic journals, because I think I get more hits on my blogs than I do on my journals. And that's just because those are inaccessible to the communities that I work with. So I hope that, you know, I'm trying to model a way as a scholar activist that it's important that you keep in mind the community that you serve in this process as a professor, and not let that be the guiding light towards the way you conduct research.
On a national level, are there certain universities that are large, private or public universities that are making significantly positive progress in some of these areas with, you know, setting up, you know, individuals that are specifically for DACA students, or do you see that happening at some universities in positive ways?
I do. You know, California, Janet Napolitano mandated that all the CU schools, the NCSU schools, have a Dream Resource Center. But that came with a lot of money. You know, she was able to give a lot of money, and so, like my friend Ming So at Berkeley, who's the director of the Undocumented Resource Center, it's just because you have a center doesn't erase the climate, right?
Yeah.
So again, it's sort of these cosmetic changes that you can make, which are great. I think it will be great for students, but unless you address sort of the root of sort of like white supremacy and this, you know, anti-immigration rhetoric that's on our campuses at the root level, you know, we're still going to have these issues. But yeah, I see, you know, the University of California system, and like I'm sitting on a dissertation with a student, a graduate student from the University of Arizona, who is a director of the Immigrant Resource Center there, and I'm like, in Arizona? Like, we can't get one in Colorado, but we can get one in Arizona. So, and it was interesting sort of to hear his take on sort of like how careful the institution wants to be, not calling it an undocumented student center, but calling it an immigrant student center. And just sort of like the finessing that has to happen to, because it's really a political act, so you have to really sort of finesse, okay, here's what the institution can live with, and here's what the students want, and where's that happy medium there. And I would say University of Michigan has done something kind of interesting where they have on their, not on their undergraduate application, but on their graduate student application, they have a box where students can check DACA or undocumented student as a way to identify funding for and supporting graduate students. So those are a couple of examples, but yeah.
Well, on behalf of Dr. Gail Stewart, also a faculty member of the School of Ed and affiliate with the Center for Racial Justice and Advocacy in the School of Education, and on behalf of us and our director, Doreen Martinez, there were a couple other folks that were here earlier and some who couldn't make it today. We thank you for coming, and we'll see you in the spring.